I'm Della Summon. I just had one thing for Brandon Moonier. I guess it would be directed to him. If the cases are not settled and they are putting up barriers, some of those barriers are going to stop at part of my ward in Ward 1, which means some of my people will be unprotected. Can you answer that question for me, if they can go on with that, or?
I don't know if I exactly follow what you're asking about. I don't know if I'm trying to answer what you're.
Well, what I'm saying is that since there's cases pending, and it seems as though one of those cases involves part of that easement, which is going to stop them from putting up barriers when they put that in the conditional use policy, putting up barriers to protect that part of Ward 1 on Crystal Avenue end. If the case isn't settled and they continue with their conditional use policy, how is that going to affect the people that are on that end of town?
Della, I'm going to try and answer your question. I still don't know if I completely understand what you're asking, but as of right now, the court has not determined exactly what rights there are over and under and around that easement. What we tried to do in the written report is in section B on the last part is prevent any disturbance of that easement whatsoever until we get a final determination from a court on what the rights are over that easement. And that's what we tried to do in the perimeter fence line provision. With the case, we even cited it specifically in there. It sounds like you have more of a question about how to protect the residents of the ward, and I don't know if I'm answering it correctly. I apologize. If you could clarify for me if I'm getting close.
You were right. You were right. But I was misunderstanding, I guess, as it was written, how they were going to continue to do that.
Della, and this is, you bring up a good point, because this document that was prepared by P&Z, it's going to be an evolving process. And Ms. McKenna brought up some good points. If there's conditions that aren't in there that you feel need to be in there, it's certainly something that this council can look at doing. In response to some of Mrs. McKenna's questions, the no scrap iron provision, Carl and I had actually talked about a few of these provisions, and we had some concern about how to define scrap iron and whether or not it limited wings from actually selling or distributing any byproduct they may have on that property. If we can figure out some way to narrow that, or even try and figure out some way just to define that, we can certainly look at a provision that prevents some type of slag pile or scrap iron or something like that. There was nothing in it that was intentionally prevented to leave out that provision. We just had a hard time defining on what we were trying to do there. The coal furnaces, kind of the same issue there too. We had, at that point, we weren't real sure what type of fuel or coke was going to be used on this particular property, and if that is something that we want to put in there, we can certainly do that, but we just need to craft the language a little better so we're not restricting wings and what they can do on that property as far as any restraints on trade or anything like that. These were not intentionally, or they were intentionally left out after we spoke to Carl Vogt, but we can revisit these if it's something that the council wants to do.
I think my question, well, I noticed they were not in there, but how can the planning and zoning vote on something and then it's not included in the record?
Well, Ms. McKenna, we addressed these things with Carl Vogt, some of these provisions particularly. It's not that they're not good provisions, we just need to figure out how to craft these with better language, and that's exactly what this process is for. If the council sees a provision that we need to add, it can be added. That's what this process is for. Planning and zoning gave you a report. Now it's time to see what you want to put in this report. You're not bound by these recommendations by the Planning and Zoning Commission. That's simply what they are, as recommendations. This council can certainly draft their own report, an entire new report if they want to. These are just recommendations from the Planning and Zoning Commission, and the council can use those in crafting their own conditional use permit, whether it's granted, denied, or based on certain conditions.
Thank you. I have to turn your mic off.
Okay, and we can go back and forth like this.
I understand what you're saying, and yes, I would like, I guess when we have a council meeting where we can make motions on vote, that's how we'll handle that. We'll have our suggested conditions and vote, just like planning and zoning did. So those can be added. I was just curious, do you have to go back to planning and zoning and ask them to change their recommendation since there was a vote and it's not included in the recommendation?
No, the regular amendment process, like you're thinking in a zoning ordinance or things like this. This is just a conditional use permit application. You have the ability to put conditions on this permit that the planning and zoning recommends, that they didn't recommend, or that you feel are reasonable on Wings Enterprises if you grant an application here. So we're going to go through, we're probably going to have some special meetings along the way where we talk about certain conditions that were raised tonight, or that the council has concern about that was in the record, and then maybe added as a provision to a condition. We'll be able to discuss those. You'll be able to take a vote on what conditions that you want and do not want. And those can be added into any conditional use permit, which is a final product that comes out of the council.
Thank you.
My name is Terry Library. I'm from Ward 4, and Debbie's presentation brought up some questions in my mind, and I don't think it's for outreach yet, maybe for Brandon or even Mayor Shilley. Once conditions are set, who makes sure that they're being followed? Whose responsibility is it to make sure or watch over it?
Once the conditions are set, we make sure we follow them. We as a council, we have a city engineer, we have our building commissioner, and it's our responsibility to see these things are done, and follow up with outreach. That is the purpose, really one of the sole purposes that we own the property. We have the deed to the property, so we do have some control to see that things are followed.
Okay, and then my second question is, and I don't know if this is something that maybe the attorneys need to look into. I would like to make it a condition that Wings Enterprises, because I know once Alberici builds the project, they don't have any control over what happens within the buildings or on the property. I want to make sure that Wings is bonded to protect Crystal City in case of a disaster, and insured. And then I'd also like to discuss, because there is a lot of discussion about jobs, and I believe this falls under welfare possibly. The developer shall ensure that construction will consist of employees no less than 50% of which shall have permanent residence in Jefferson County, Missouri prior to employment at the site. The owner of the facility shall ensure that the manning of the operation shall consist of employees no less than 50% of which have been residents of Jefferson County for at least 2 years prior to employment. Just make sure that our people get the jobs there.
Is that all, council members? Okay, thank you. Any other council members got anything they'd like to add, or? Mr. Eisenbach? Mr. Pickroll? Mr. Porter? Mr. DeClue?
Just that I think that this presentation's really come along very nicely. I think we're close. I think we're really close. I think that these gentlemen should be